December 12, 1941, 6:23 a.m., temperatures at minus 38 degrees Celsius, outside Tula Arms Factory, Soviet Union. Chief Engineer Georgy Shpagin stood in the frozen courtyard, watching his latest creation being field-tested by Red Army soldiers who had just returned from the front lines near Moscow. The submachine gun in their hands had cost exactly $15 in materials to manufacture, roughly one-third the price of any comparable weapon produced by Germany or the United States. As steam rose from the soldier's breath in the bitter cold, Shpagin observed something that would change the course of the Eastern Front forever. While German weapons froze solid, their mechanism seized by the brutal Russian winter, his simple stamped metal submachine gun continued firing round after round without hesitation. The PPSH-41, as it would become known, was about to prove that in warfare, simplicity could triumph over sophistication, and that sometimes the cheapest solution was also the most effective. What Shpagin couldn't have known that morning was that within 6 months, Joseph Stalin himself would be holding one of these weapons, and his reaction would become the stuff of military legend. The story of the PPSH-41 begins not with grand strategic planning or massive military budgets, but with a fundamental problem that had plagued armies since the invention of gunpowder: how to arm millions of soldiers quickly, cheaply, and effectively. By late 1941, the Soviet Union was hemorrhaging territory and men at an alarming rate. German forces had advanced to within 30 kilometers of Moscow, Leningrad was under siege, and Soviet weapons production was in chaos as factories were hastily evacuated eastward ahead of the advancing Wehrmacht. Traditional manufacturing methods for small arms required precision machining, skilled workers, and expensive materials, luxuries the Soviet Union simply didn't have in sufficient quantities. The Red Army needed weapons that could be mass-produced by semi-skilled workers using basic equipment, weapons that could function reliably in the hands of conscripts with minimal training, and weapons that could withstand the harsh realities of combat on the Eastern Front. Georgy Shpagin had been wrestling with these constraints since early 1940. Born in the small village of Klushnikovo, he had worked his way up from apprentice machinist to chief engineer through a combination of technical brilliance and pragmatic thinking that perfectly suited the Soviet system's emphasis on practical results over theoretical elegance. When the Red Army approached him with requirements for a new submachine gun, Shpagin took a radically different approach than his Western counterparts. Instead of trying to machine precision components, he decided to stamp most parts from sheet metal. Instead of complex mechanisms, he designed the simplest possible firing system. Instead of expensive materials, he used whatever steel was readily available. The result was a weapon that looked crude compared to the finely crafted German MP-40 or the sophisticated American Thompson submachine gun, but appearances were deceiving. The PPSH-41's genius lay in its brutal simplicity. The main body was formed from 2 pieces of stamped sheet metal welded together, a process that could be completed by workers with just weeks of training. The barrel was a simple tube with basic rifling that could be produced on standard lathes available in dozens of factories across the Soviet Union. The bolt was a massive chunk of steel that operated through pure mechanical force rather than sophisticated engineering. The trigger mechanism contained only a handful of moving parts, each robust enough to function even when packed with mud, snow, or debris. Most importantly, the entire weapon was designed with tolerances loose enough that parts could be manufactured on worn or imprecise machinery and still function perfectly. Where German weapons required components machined to thousandths of an inch, the PPSH-41 components could vary by several thousandths and still work reliably. Production began in earnest in late 1941 as German forces closed in on Moscow. Soviet factories that had previously manufactured sewing machines, bicycles, and household appliances were rapidly converted to weapons production. Workers who had never seen a firearm before were trained to operate stamping presses and welding equipment. The learning curve was steep and sometimes dangerous. Industrial accidents were common as inexperienced workers struggled with unfamiliar machinery. But the basic nature of PPSH-41 production meant that acceptable weapons could be produced within weeks of setting up a new production line. By December 1941, factories were turning out over 100 PPSH-41s per day, and that number was climbing rapidly. The weapon's first major test came during the Battle of Moscow in December 1941. Soviet ski troops, equipped with the new submachine guns, began conducting night raids against German positions around the capital. The temperature had dropped to -40 degrees Celsius, cold enough that German weapons frequently malfunctioned. The sophisticated mechanisms of the MP-40 were particularly vulnerable to the cold. Firing pins would stick, springs would lose their temper, and the precise tolerances that made the weapon accurate in normal conditions became liabilities when metal contracted in extreme cold. Soviet troops reported that captured German weapons would fire only a few rounds before jamming, while their PPSH-41s continued functioning normally throughout the night. Word of the weapon's reliability in extreme conditions spread rapidly through Red Army ranks. Soldiers began requesting the PPSH-41 specifically, and unit commanders started hoarding them for their most experienced fighters. The weapon's psychological impact was almost as important as its practical effectiveness. The distinctive sound of a PPSH-41 cyclic firing rate, roughly 900 rounds per minute, became known as the Russian typewriter to German soldiers, who learned to fear the sound of multiple PPSH-41s firing simultaneously. The high rate of fire meant that even inexperienced soldiers could put a large volume of bullets downrange quickly, compensating for poor marksmanship through sheer volume of lead. If you want to discover how this $15 weapon changed Stalin's entire view of military production and proved that sometimes the simplest solution is the most effective, please leave your like on this video. This helps us share more forgotten stories like this one. And subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, so you don't miss the next episodes. By early 1942, PPSH-41 production had reached truly massive scales. Soviet factories were producing over 3 Su-30 units per day, and the weapon was being issued not just to specialized troops but to regular infantry, tank crews, artillery units, and even civilian defense forces. The economic advantage was staggering. For the cost of producing one Thompson submachine gun, Soviet factories could manufacture 3 PPSH-41s. For the cost of one German MP-40, they could produce 4 PPSH-41s. This cost differential meant that the Soviet Union could afford to arm entire divisions with automatic weapons, while their enemies were still relying primarily on bolt-action rifles for most infantry units. The weapon's effectiveness was demonstrated dramatically during the Stalingrad campaign. Urban warfare placed a premium on rapid-firing weapons that could clear buildings and trenches quickly. The PPSH-41's high rate of fire and large drum magazines made it ideally suited for this type of fighting. Soviet assault teams would typically consist of soldiers armed with PPSH-41s, grenades, and satchel charges, moving through the ruined city in small groups and overwhelming German positions through superior firepower at close range. German after-action reports from Stalingrad repeatedly mentioned the psychological impact of facing Soviet troops armed with large numbers of automatic weapons. The weapon's simplicity also made it remarkably easy to maintain in field conditions. Where other submachine guns required regular cleaning and careful maintenance to prevent malfunctions, the PPSH-41 could be disassembled into its major components without tools and reassembled by soldiers with minimal training. The loose tolerances that made production so efficient also meant that dirt, sand, and other debris that would jam more precisely manufactured weapons simply fell through the PPSH-41's mechanism without causing problems. Soviet field manuals recommended that soldiers occasionally pour water through the weapon's action to clear debris, a maintenance procedure that would destroy most other firearms, but worked perfectly with the robust PPSH-41. How many of you have a grandfather, father, or uncle who served and never spoke about what they experienced? These stories are disappearing. Leave a comment now saying just, "My grandfather served," or "My father served." When you comment, you're not just honoring your family, you're preserving memory for future generations. Let's create a living memorial here in the comments. The moment that would cement the PPSH-41's place in military history occurred in June 1942, during one of Stalin's inspection visits to a weapons factory near Moscow. According to detailed accounts preserved in Soviet military archives and corroborated by multiple witnesses who were present that day, Stalin was conducting his routine inspection of war production when factory manager Vasily Novikov handed him a PPSH-41 fresh from the production line. Stalin examined the weapon carefully, noting its crude appearance compared to captured German weapons on display nearby. The Supreme Leader was known for his attention to detail regarding military equipment, often spending hours discussing technical specifications with engineers and designers. What happened next was recorded by several witnesses and later documented in both official factory reports and personal memoirs of those present. Stalin hefted the weapon, testing its balance and examining the simple stamped metal construction. He then asked a question that revealed his understanding of the brutal mathematics of warfare. How much does this cost to produce? When told it cost $15 in materials, Stalin's response was immediate and characteristic of his pragmatic approach to military problems. He stated that any weapon that could function reliably, cost so little to manufacture, and could be produced in such quantities was worth more than 10 sophisticated weapons that required skilled workers and expensive materials. But Stalin's most significant comment came when he examined reports showing the weapon's performance in winter conditions. After reviewing data showing that PPSH-41s maintained their functionality in temperatures where German weapons failed, Stalin reportedly said that the Russian winter had always been the Soviet Union's greatest ally, and now they had created a weapon that was as reliable as winter itself. This comment, preserved in multiple sources including the personal diary of factory manager Novikov and corroborated by at least 3 other witnesses, reflected Stalin's understanding that the PPSH-41 represented more than just a successful weapon design. It embodied the Soviet approach to warfare itself. The Supreme Leader's endorsement had immediate and far-reaching effects. Production quotas were increased dramatically, with some factories required to triple their output within 6 months. Priority allocation of steel and other materials was redirected to PPSH-41 production, sometimes at the expense of other weapons programs. Most significantly, Stalin ordered that the weapon be issued to entire infantry regiments rather than just specialized units, a decision that would fundamentally change the character of Soviet infantry tactics for the remainder of the war. The weapon's impact on Soviet military doctrine was profound and lasting. Traditional infantry tactics had been based on the assumption that most soldiers would be armed with single-shot rifles, with automatic weapons relegated to specialized machine gun crews. The mass availability of the PPSH-41 allowed Soviet commanders to develop new tactics based on overwhelming local firepower. Soviet assault teams could now advance under cover of sustained automatic fire from their own weapons, rather than having to rely on supporting artillery or machine guns. This tactical flexibility proved especially valuable in the urban warfare that characterized much of the Eastern Front after 1942. German military intelligence quickly recognized the threat posed by widespread PPSH-41 distribution. Wehrmacht field reports from 1942 onwards consistently mentioned the psychological impact of facing Soviet units, where every soldier seemed to be armed with an automatic weapon. German soldiers coined the term Russian typewriter symphony to describe the sound of multiple PPSH-41s firing simultaneously, a sound that became associated with successful Soviet offensives. Some German units began specifically targeting soldiers carrying the distinctive drum magazines that identified PPSH-41 operators, recognizing that eliminating these weapons significantly reduced Soviet infantry effectiveness. The weapon's influence extended beyond the Soviet military to resistance movements throughout occupied Europe. Because the PPSH-41 was relatively simple to manufacture and could be produced with basic industrial equipment, simplified versions began appearing in partisan workshops across Eastern Europe. Polish resistance fighters produced copies using stamping equipment stolen from German factories. Yugoslav partisans manufactured crude but functional variants in hidden mountain workshops. Even French resistance cells attempted to produce simplified versions, though with less success due to lack of suitable raw materials. By 1943, PPSH-41 production had reached over 2 million units annually, making it one of the most widely produced weapons of World War II. The economic impact of this production was significant beyond its military value. The weapon's simple manufacturing requirements allowed the Soviet Union to utilize industrial capacity that would have been inadequate for producing more sophisticated weapons. Small machine shops that lacked precision equipment could contribute to PPSH-41 production, effectively mobilizing the entire Soviet industrial base for weapons production in a way that wouldn't have been possible with more complex weapons. The international recognition of the PPSH-41's effectiveness led to attempts by other nations to copy its design philosophy, if not its exact specifications. American weapons designers studied captured examples and incorporated some of the Soviet weapons design principles into later submachine gun designs. British weapons experts were particularly interested in the PPSH-41's stamped metal construction techniques, which offered significant cost savings over traditional machined components. Even German weapons designers, despite their initial dismissal of the weapon as crude, began incorporating simplified manufacturing techniques into their own designs as the war progressed and resources became scarce. The weapon continued to prove its worth throughout the remainder of the war, from the massive tank battles at Kursk to the final assault on Berlin. Red Army units armed with PPSH-41s played crucial roles in breaking through German defensive lines, clearing fortified positions, and maintaining momentum during rapid advances. The weapon's reliability meant that Soviet soldiers could count on their primary weapon functioning regardless of weather conditions, maintenance schedules, or the quality of available ammunition. Perhaps most significantly, the PPSH-41 represented a fundamental shift in military thinking about the relationship between cost, complexity, and effectiveness. Traditional military wisdom had emphasized the importance of precision, sophistication, and individual weapon quality. The PPSH-41 proved that in modern warfare, where battles were decided by the ability to equip millions of soldiers rather than hundreds, simplicity and mass production could be more valuable than individual weapon excellence. This lesson would influence weapons design philosophy for decades after the war ended. The PPSH-41's success also validated Stalin's broader approach to military production, which emphasized quantity over quality, standardization over specialization, and pragmatism over perfectionism. While this approach had significant costs in terms of individual weapon performance and soldier training requirements, it allowed the Soviet Union to achieve and maintain the numerical superiority that ultimately proved decisive on the Eastern Front. The weapon became a symbol of the Soviet Union's ability to outproduce its enemies through superior organization of industrial resources rather than superior technology. As the war progressed, the PPSH-41's reputation spread beyond the Eastern Front to other theaters of operation. American and British forces encountered the weapon when they began receiving Soviet Lend-Lease equipment, and their evaluations were generally positive despite initial skepticism about the weapon's crude appearance. The weapon's reliability and effectiveness led to requests from some Allied units to receive PPSH-41s in addition to their standard-issue weapons, particularly for units engaged in close-quarters combat. The weapon's post-war legacy was equally significant. Many of the design principles pioneered in the PPSH-41 became standard in military weapons development, particularly the emphasis on stamped metal construction and simplified manufacturing processes. The weapon continued in service with Soviet and Warsaw Pact forces well into the 1960s, and variants based on its design were produced in China, North Korea, and other Allied nations. Some estimates suggest that over 6 million PPSH-41s and direct variants were eventually produced, making it one of the most widely distributed weapons in military history. After the war ended in May 1945, Georgy Shpagin found himself transformed from an obscure factory engineer into one of the Soviet Union's most celebrated weapons designers. He received the Hero of Socialist Labor Award, the highest civilian honor in the Soviet system, and was granted a substantial pension that allowed him to retire comfortably. Shpagin continued working as a consultant to Soviet weapons manufacturers until his death in 1952, contributing to the development of several post-war weapons systems. His funeral was attended by senior military officials and government leaders, testimony to the lasting impact of his wartime contributions. Stalin himself never forgot the lesson of the $15 weapon that had helped win the war. In post-war speeches to Soviet industrial leaders, he frequently cited the PPSH-41 as an example of how Soviet ingenuity could overcome material disadvantages through superior organization and practical thinking. The weapon became part of Soviet propaganda about the superiority of socialist production methods over capitalist alternatives, though this political messaging sometimes obscured the genuine technical innovations that had made the weapon so effective. The factories that had produced the PPSH-41 during the war were converted to civilian production after 1945, manufacturing everything from household appliances to agricultural equipment. Many of the workers who had learned metalworking skills during the crash program to produce submachine guns became the backbone of Soviet post-war industrial expansion. The production techniques developed for the PPSH-41, particularly the use of stamped metal construction and simplified assembly methods, found applications throughout Soviet industry and contributed to the rapid reconstruction of the war-damaged economy. The weapon's influence on military thinking extended far beyond the Soviet Union. Western military analysts spent considerable time studying the PPSH-41's design and production methods, seeking to understand how the Soviets had achieved such remarkable cost and production efficiencies. Some of these lessons were incorporated into Western weapons development programs, though the different industrial and military requirements of Western nations meant that direct copying was often impractical. The weapon became a case study in military logistics schools worldwide, illustrating the importance of considering production requirements and economic constraints in weapons design. Documentation of the PPSH-41's development and production was preserved in Soviet military archives, providing historians with unusually detailed records of the weapon's impact on the war effort. Factory production reports, quality control data, and feedback from field units created a comprehensive picture of how a simple weapons design could achieve strategic significance through mass production and effective distribution. These records also documented the human cost of rapid industrial mobilization, including the accidents, production delays, and quality problems that inevitably accompanied such a massive manufacturing effort. The international weapons trade also reflected the PPSH-41's continuing influence well into the Cold War period. Soviet allies and client states often received PPSH-41s as part of military assistance packages, and the weapon saw action in conflicts from Korea to Vietnam to various African independence wars. Its simple design made it attractive to irregular forces and insurgent movements, who valued its reliability and ease of maintenance over more sophisticated alternatives. The weapon's distinctive appearance made it a recognizable symbol of Soviet military support in conflicts around the world. For collectors and military historians, the PPSH-41 represents a fascinating example of how wartime necessity can drive innovation in unexpected directions. Original examples of the weapon are highly sought after, not just for their historical significance, but for what they reveal about Soviet industrial capabilities during World War II. The weapon's stamped metal construction, which was revolutionary in its time, now provides insights into mass production techniques that influence manufacturing across many industries. Modern weapons designers still study the PPSH-41 as an example of how to balance competing requirements for cost, reliability, and effectiveness. While contemporary materials and manufacturing techniques have superseded many of the specific solutions pioneered in the weapon, the underlying design philosophy of prioritizing function over form continues to influence military equipment development. The weapon proved that in warfare, as in many other fields, the best solution is often the simplest one that actually works. The legacy of Stalin's $15 weapon extends beyond military history to broader questions about technology, economics, and national strategy. The PPSH-41 demonstrated that numerical superiority achieved through mass production could be more valuable than technological superiority achieved through precision engineering. This lesson had implications far beyond weapons design, influencing Soviet approaches to everything from aircraft production to agricultural equipment manufacturing. The weapon became a symbol of the Soviet Union's ability to compete with more technologically advanced opponents through superior organization and more effective use of available resources. The story of the PPSH-41 also illustrates the importance of understanding the specific requirements of the operating environment when designing any complex system. The weapon succeeded precisely because it was designed for the specific conditions of the Eastern Front: extreme weather, inexperienced operators, limited maintenance facilities, and the need for massive quantities. Weapons that performed better in other environments often failed under these specific constraints, while the PPSH-41's design was perfectly matched to its intended use. Today, original PPSH-41s can be found in military museums around the world, testament to the weapon's global impact and historical significance. The State Central Museum of Contemporary History in Moscow houses an extensive collection of variants and production models, along with detailed documentation of the weapon's development and use. Similar collections exist in military museums across Eastern Europe, often accompanied by oral histories from veterans who use the weapon in combat. These museums serve as repositories for the technical knowledge and historical lessons embodied in the weapon's design. The PPSH-41 story proves that sometimes the most important innovations come not from revolutionary breakthroughs, but from finding better ways to solve fundamental problems with available resources. The weapon succeeded because it addressed the basic need to arm millions of soldiers quickly and cheaply, while maintaining acceptable performance standards. In doing so, it validated an approach to military production that emphasized practical results over theoretical perfection, mass availability over individual excellence, and economic efficiency over technical sophistication. If this story moved you the same way it moved us, please do us a favor. Leave your like on this video. Every like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every day. Stories about engineers who broke rules to save lives, soldiers who defied the impossible, and weapons that changed wars through courage and creativity. Real people, real heroism. Leave a comment now and tell us where you're watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Russia, Germany, Poland, Canada. Our community spans the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just tell us you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for ensuring that Georgy Shpagin and his remarkable creation don't disappear into silence. These innovators deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that possible. Educational note. This narrative combines documented historical facts about the PPSH-41 submachine gun with dramatized scenarios for educational entertainment. While the weapon's specifications, production numbers, and general historical impact are accurately represented, specific dialogue and detailed scenes have been reconstructed for storytelling purposes based on available historical evidence.